Can't your military pay even afford a real lawyer, Sophie? My father's smug laughter echoed across the courtroom, joined by the snickers of his high-priced legal defense team and his new wife. Everyone looked at me like I was a lost, outmatched daughter walking straight into financial slaughter. My name is Sophie Madden. At 29 years old, I was a captain in the U.S. Army, standing alone in civilian court against the wealthy father who spent years trying to strip away my late mother's family estate. He thought showing up in my uniform without an expensive private attorney meant I was weak, broke, and surrendered. He leaned back, confident he had won everything. Then the judge turned to me, and I opened my folder. I stood straight, looked directly into my father's eyes, and spoke 3 words that turned his face completely pale. My name is Sophie Madden. At 29 years old, I stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting of Department 4B wearing my U.S. Army service uniform, carrying nothing more than a single leather binder. Across the polished oak courtroom sat my father, Richard Madden, looking every bit the ruthless real estate mogul he was. He was flanked by 3 high-priced corporate defense attorneys, each wearing watches that cost more than a soldier's yearly salary. Beside him sat his second wife, Evelyn, smirking behind dark designer sunglasses. They hadn't gathered here out of respect or family duty. They were here to execute a final, legal ambush. Richard had filed emergency motions to completely dissolve my late mother's irrevocable trust, a legacy meant to safeguard our family's historic 200-acre estate and the charitable foundation my mother built before cancer took her from me. To Richard, it was merely $40 million in prime commercial development land that he wanted to bulldoze for luxury condominiums. Your Honor, Richard's lead attorney sneered, gesturing toward me with theatrical condescension. The petitioner arrives without representation. She clearly fails to grasp the financial gravity of these proceedings. We ask for an immediate summary judgment. Richard leaned back, chuckling under his breath, confident that my absence of private counsel meant utter surrender. He believed my 6 years in uniform had left me naive, penniless, and helpless against his legal powerhouse. He had no idea that walking into this courtroom alone wasn't an act of desperation. It was a calculated trap. For as long as I could remember, my father viewed relationships as transactions. When my mother passed away during my senior year of high school, Richard didn't grieve. He simply restructured his life. Within 6 months, Evelyn moved in, bringing her lavish demands and an unspoken mission to push me out of our own home. Richard made it clear that my mother's old-fashioned values had no place in his new empire. If I wanted financial support, I would have to obey his every demand, abandon my ambitions, and sign over my maternal inheritance. Instead, I chose the Army. I traded his suffocating world of toxic wealth for combat boots, strict discipline, and true purpose. Earning my commission gave me an identity he could never buy or control. While I was deployed overseas leading logistics and operations in high-stress zones, Richard assumed I was out of sight and out of the game. He took full advantage of my absence. Using back-channel shell companies and falsified notary stamps, Richard began systematically chipping away at my mother's trust. He diverted commercial revenue into his failing real estate developments, convinced that a deployed soldier halfway across the world would never notice the missing millions. To him, my silence was weakness. He thought a soldier in uniform was just someone who followed orders and took whatever crumbs were thrown at her feet. But military service hadn't made me blind to corruption. It had trained me to recognize an ambush from miles away, gather irrefutable intelligence, and prepare the ultimate counteroffensive. The betrayal became impossible to ignore the moment my boots touched civilian soil after a 10-month overseas tour. When I drove up the familiar winding driveway of my mother's heritage estate, I wasn't greeted by the quiet beauty of her rose gardens. Instead, glaring orange eviction notices were taped to the historic oak doors, marked with official court seals declaring the property abandoned and slated for commercial liquidation. Richard hadn't just raided the trust, he had declared me legally absent and defaulted in probate filings, claiming I had abandoned all family responsibilities while abroad. 2 days later, Richard summoned me to a private dining club downtown. He sat across from me in a tailored suit, swirling a glass of vintage wine while Evelyn adjusted a diamond bracelet that once belonged to my mother. Without looking me in the eye, he slid a certified bank check across the white linen tablecloth. $5,000. "Take it, Sophie," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You chose the military, which means you chose to be broke. You don't have the background, the network, or the capital to fight my legal team. Sign the quitclaim deed, walk away quietly, and use this money to rent a modest apartment near your base. It's more than you deserve." Evelyn laughed, adding that a woman in combat fatigues had no business managing $40 million in prime real estate. I looked down at the check, then up at the man who had abandoned every promise he ever made to my dying mother. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply slid the check back across the table, picked up my service cap, and walked out into the rain. He genuinely believed I was defenseless. Back in Department 4B, the courtroom atmosphere thickened with manufactured certainty. Richard's lead attorney, a slick corporate litigator named Vance Sterling, stepped forward to the podium with practiced ease. He dropped a thick stack of glossy financial statements onto the court reporter's desk, the sound echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. "Your Honor," Sterling proclaimed, projecting his voice with polished arrogance, "we have submitted comprehensive certified filings demonstrating that the estate's liabilities far exceed its liquidated value. Under the restructured governance provisions, Mr. Richard Madden has assumed full fiduciary control to salvage the properties from complete insolvency. Captain Madden's objections are purely sentimental, legally groundless, and constitute a frivolous obstruction of legitimate commerce." Sterling turned slightly to cast a patronizing smirk in my direction before continuing. "The respondent lacks legal standing, possesses no recognized equity under the current corporate structure, and has failed to present licensed counsel. We formally request the court dismiss her claims with prejudice and order immediate transfer of the remaining trust titles to the plaintiff." Judge Harrison, an imposing figure with decades on the bench, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from his dais directly at me. His expression was stern, tempered with the weary caution of a judge dealing with unrepresented citizens. "Captain Madden," Judge Harrison said, his deep voice filling the silence, "civilian probate and corporate property statutes are extraordinarily complex. The petitioner has submitted extensive documentation prepared by senior counsel. Do you fully understand that proceeding pro se, without licensed representation, exposes you to severe financial sanctions, attorney fees, and the permanent loss of all claim to this estate?" At the plaintiff's table, Richard crossed his legs and leaned back, exchanging a triumphant glance with Evelyn. He rested his chin on his hands, smiling broadly, convinced his victory was already sealed. I stood up from behind the defense table, straightened the creases of my service uniform, and walked steadily to the center lectern. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Every eye in the gallery was fixed on me, waiting for the stammering apology of a young officer who had realized she was out of her depth. I placed my leather binder on the wooden stand, opened it calmly, and looked Judge Harrison directly in the eye. "Your Honor," I began, my voice ringing clear, steady, and commanding. "I am not proceeding out of ignorance, nor am I outmatched. I do not require civilian counsel today because I'm a Judge Advocate General's Corps officer and a certified federal investigator for the Department of Defense." The words landed like a physical detonation in the room. Across the aisle, Richard's smug smile vanished instantly. His posture collapsed, his chin slipping from his hands as every drop of color drained from his face until his skin was the shade of dry chalk. Evelyn's jaw dropped open in stunned disbelief. Behind them, Vance Sterling's confident expression shattered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the gold insignia pinned above my ribbons, the crossed sword and pen of the U.S. Army JAG Corps. Furthermore, Your Honor, I continued, unyielding, while Mr. Sterling was presenting his opening remarks, my office filed certified federal evidentiary binders directly to this court's registry. For the past 6 months, operating under full federal authority, I have conducted a joint forensic audit alongside the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I turned slowly to face Richard, watching his hands begin to tremble against the mahogany table. My father assumed that my deployment overseas meant I was helpless. What he failed to realize is that my active military deployment specifically grants me full protections under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Attempting to seize property, forge signatures, and default an active duty officer while deployed is not merely a civil violation, Your Honor. It is a federal felony. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his demeanor transforming instantly into absolute scrutiny. He adjusted his glasses and opened the electronic registry on his bench monitor, where the stamped federal seals were already flashing across the secure screen. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, his voice dropping into dangerous gravel. Are you aware of the filings currently entering my docket? Sterling stood frozen at his table, frantically shuffling papers, whispering in hurried, terrified tones with his junior associates. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were entirely unaware of the respondent's specific jurisdictional capacity. Allow me to clarify the irregularities, Your Honor, I said, stepping forward with my evidence log. Exhibit Alpha contains forensic banking records tracing $32 million systematically drained from my late mother's irrevocable trust over an 18-month period. These funds did not vanish into legitimate corporate losses. They were routed through 3 offshore shell entities in the Cayman Islands, all directly registered under Richard Madden's sole beneficial ownership. Richard gripped the edge of the counsel table, his knuckles turning stark white as beads of cold sweat rolled down his temples. Furthermore, I continued, my voice ringing clear through the dead silent gallery, Exhibit Bravo details 6 separate quitclaim deeds and corporate restructuring documents bearing my supposed signature. We have submitted sworn affidavits from federal forensic document examiners confirming every single signature was forged while I was deployed 4,000 miles away in an active theater of operations. Evelyn let out a muffled gasp and buried her face in her hands. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, any default judgment, property alienation, or civil restructuring executed against an active duty service member without explicit judicial review constitutes severe, willful federal misconduct. In addition to wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate money laundering. Judge Harrison looked up from the evidence, his gaze locking onto Richard and his trembling legal team with piercing fury. Counsel, Judge Harrison warned, if these documents verify what I am looking at right now, you and your client are not just losing this civil suit, you are walking straight into federal indictments. Judge Harrison brought his gavel down with a single, resounding crack that finalized our fate. The petitioner's motions are dismissed with extreme prejudice. All disputed estate titles and frozen assets are remanded immediately to Captain Sophie Madden. This court is formally issuing a criminal referral to the United States Attorney's Office for elder financial abuse, grand larceny, and federal fraud. Richard collapsed back into his leather chair, a broken shell of the man who had laughed at me only an hour before. As I walked out of the courtroom into the sunlit marble rotunda, Richard rushed after me, his voice trembling and desperate.